The moment they laugh at you is the moment everything can change, someone once said, and Emily Carter felt it the second the glass slipped from her hand and shattered across the polished marble floor as red wine splashed up her apron and stained her pale blue uniform in front of a room full of people who looked like they had never worried about rent in their lives. The laughter didn't start loud, it built slowly. Like a ripple turning into a wave, a few chuckles from the corner table, then whispers, then phones lifted casually, recording, always recording, and Emily froze for just half a second before dropping to her knees, gathering broken pieces with shaking fingers, her breath tight in her chest as if the air itself had turned heavy. She could feel every eye on her, could feel the weight of judgment pressing down harder than the long double shift she had already worked. Someone muttered something about clumsy help. Another voice joked about tips being deducted, and still she said nothing, because she had learned that silence cost less than pride. Somewhere across the room, behind a table draped in quiet authority, Sebastian Moretti watched without moving, his dark suit untouched by the chaos, his expression unreadable, the kind of stillness that didn't belong in a place like this. He didn't laugh, didn't speak, he just watched as Emily wiped the floor with a cloth that trembled in her grip, her sleeve sliding back just enough to reveal a faint bruise along her wrist, not dramatic, not loud, just there, like a story no one had asked to hear. And that was the moment his gaze sharpened, not with anger, not with sympathy, but with something colder, something deliberate. Emily finished cleaning, stood up slowly, her hands damp, her heart still racing, and turned to leave the table as if nothing had happened, as if humiliation could be folded away like a napkin at the end of a meal. But she didn't make it far, because a hand reached out, firm but controlled, catching her wrist just enough to stop her without pulling, without force, and when she looked up, she found his eyes on hers, steady, unblinking. "Look at me," he said quietly, his voice low enough that no one else heard, and for the first time that night, Emily didn't look away, she didn't smile, didn't apologize, she just stood there, tired in a way that had nothing to do with her shift, and something in that silence shifted, subtle but real, like the air before a storm. He held her gaze for 1 second longer, then released her just as easily as he had stopped her, stepping back as if nothing had happened, as if he had never touched her at all, and without another word, he turned and walked out of the restaurant, leaving behind a room that slowly returned to its noise, its laughter, its indifference. But Emily felt it, that strange, quiet interruption, like a line drawn somewhere she couldn't yet see, and as she stepped out into the cool night air 10 minutes later, the city lights blurring slightly in her tired eyes, she had no idea that by midnight, the people who laughed at her would be gone from that room, and someone who never needed to raise his voice had already decided that what happened to her would not happen again. The night air felt colder than it should have as Emily Carter stepped out onto the sidewalk, her damp uniform clinging slightly to her skin while the neon lights from the restaurant flickered behind her like nothing had happened at all, like the laughter was already forgotten by everyone except her. She wrapped her arms around herself and walked toward the bus stop 2 blocks away, her shoes clicking softly against the pavement, each step slower than the last as exhaustion settled deep in her bones, not just from the shift, but from the weight of being seen at her lowest and having no one step in, no one except that one moment, that one voice, that one pair of eyes that had told her to look up instead of down. She shook her head slightly as if to clear it, telling herself it meant nothing, that men like him did not step into lives like hers, that whatever that moment was, it had already passed. But still, she could not stop thinking about the way he had looked at her, not with pity, not with judgment, but with something sharper, something that made her feel exposed in a way that had nothing to do with the spilled wine. The bus arrived with a tired hiss of brakes and she climbed aboard, dropping a few crumpled bills into the box before finding a seat near the back. The city blurred past the window as she stared at her reflection in the glass, faint and distorted, a woman who looked older than 27, who had learned to survive by staying quiet and moving forward no matter what was thrown at her. Her phone buzzed in her bag and she pulled it out quickly, her heart tightening when she saw the message from the babysitter. "Everything is okay. He is asleep." Relief softened her shoulders just enough for her to breathe again, because no matter what happened tonight, no matter how small she felt under those lights, she still had someone waiting for her, someone who depended on her to come home. The bus ride took 20 minutes, each stop marked by the low hum of the engine and the quiet shuffle of strangers getting on and off, and by the time she stepped down onto her street, the world felt smaller, quieter. Like she had stepped out of one life and back into another, her apartment building stood at the corner, old brick, dim lights, familiar in a way that grounded her. She climbed the stairs slowly, her hand brushing along the railing as she reached the second floor, keys in hand, already thinking about a hot shower and a few hours of sleep before the next shift. But something felt different the moment she reached her door, not wrong, just different, like the air itself had shifted slightly. She paused, listening, then shook it off and unlocked the door, stepping inside to the soft glow of a lamp and the quiet breathing of her son asleep on the couch, a blanket tucked around him, his small hand curled near his face, and just like that, the noise of the night faded into the background, replaced by something steady, something real. She moved quietly, setting her bag down and kneeling beside him, brushing his hair back gently, grounding herself in the simple rhythm of his breathing. But across the city, in a place far removed from her small apartment, the night had not ended the same way for everyone, because in a quiet office overlooking dark streets, Sebastian Moretti stood by the window, his reflection sharp against the glass as he listened to a calm voice confirming details he had not needed to ask twice, his expression unchanged, his tone even when he finally spoke, not loud, not dramatic, just certain. "Make sure they understand," he said, pausing just long enough for the weight of the words to settle. "Some lines are not crossed twice," and when the call ended, he remained still for a moment longer before turning away from the window, as if what he had set in motion required no further attention. While somewhere across the city, Emily Carter finally closed her eyes, unaware that the night she thought she had survived quietly had already been rewritten by someone who had decided that silence was not the same as permission. Morning arrived too quickly, the pale light slipping through thin curtains as Emily Carter woke to the quiet hum of the city already moving without her. For a moment she stayed still, staring at the ceiling, letting the memory of the night before settle into something she could carry, not something that would break her. Her son shifted beside her on the couch, still half asleep, and she smiled softly, brushing a hand over his hair before standing and moving through the small apartment with practiced routine, coffee brewing, breakfast simple, the kind of morning built on repetition and resilience. By the time she stepped back onto the street an hour later, dressed in a clean uniform and holding her bag close, she had already tucked the humiliation away where it could not reach her voice. Not today, not again. The walk to the bus stop felt different, quieter somehow, though the city was the same. Traffic, horns, strangers passing without looking twice. She told herself it was just another day, just another shift, but something lingered under the surface, a question she could not quite name. The restaurant looked unchanged when she arrived, the same polished windows, the same doorman who nodded without really seeing her. Inside, the staff moved as usual, orders being called, trays carried, conversations blending into the background noise of a place that thrived on appearances. But the moment Emily stepped onto the floor, she felt it, not eyes judging her this time, but something else, something unsettled. Whispers cut short when she passed, a glance from the hostess that lingered a second too long. She frowned slightly but said nothing, tying her apron and moving into her section as if everything was normal, as if she belonged there as much as anyone else. Her first table was quiet, polite, her hand steady as she poured water, her voice calm as she recited the specials. Nothing like the night before, and yet, the absence of that same group, that loud table, that careless laughter, felt louder than their presence had been. She caught Maria's eye across the room, her coworker hesitating before stepping closer, lowering her voice just enough. "Did you hear?" She started, then stopped, glancing toward the manager's office. "Never mind." Emily shook her head gently. "Hear what?" Maria bit her lip, clearly debating, then leaned in slightly. "They are not coming back," she said quietly. "Something happened last night, I do not know what, but Marco said their reservation was cancelled permanently." Emily blinked, the words settling slowly, not dramatic, not shocking, just strange, like a piece of a puzzle she had not realized she was holding. She nodded once, forcing a small smile. "Maybe they found somewhere else," she said, keeping her tone light, but Maria only looked at her for a second longer before stepping away, unconvinced. The shift continued, smooth, almost too smooth, no raised voices, no careless comments, just the steady rhythm of service, and every so often, Emily felt it again, that quiet awareness, like something had changed just beneath the surface of everything. By the time her break came, she stepped outside into the afternoon light, the air warmer now, grounding. She leaned against the brick wall, exhaling slowly, telling herself it was coincidence, that people came and went all the time, that the world did not rearrange itself because of one moment, because of one man, and yet, as she closed her eyes for just a second, she saw it again, the way he had looked at her, the way he had said those 3 words, "Look at me," and for reasons she could not explain, it no longer felt like a memory. It felt like the beginning of something she had not chosen, but could not ignore. The rest of the shift passed with a strange kind of quiet that Emily Carter could not shake, the kind that settled into the edges of every conversation and every glance, as if something unseen had already changed the rules of the room and everyone felt it without understanding why. She moved from table to table with steady hands, her voice calm, her posture straight, but inside, there was a tension she could not name, not fear, not exactly, just awareness, like standing at the edge of something she could not yet see. When her shift finally ended, the sky outside had already dimmed into early evening, the city lights beginning to flicker on one by one. She untied her apron slowly, folding it with care before placing it in her bag, the simple act grounding her in a way nothing else had all day. Maria gave her a small wave from across the room, a look that held questions she did not ask out loud, and Emily returned it with a faint smile before heading toward the back exit. The hallway was narrow, dimly lit, the sound of the restaurant fading behind her with each step until it was replaced by the distant hum of traffic outside. She pushed the door open and stepped into the cool air, the faint scent of rain lingering on the pavement. For a moment, she just stood there, breathing, letting the quiet settle around her. Then she started toward the parking lot, her footsteps soft against the concrete, her mind already shifting back to her son, to home, to everything that mattered more than what had happened inside those walls. But she stopped when she saw the black car parked near the far end. Not unusual in itself, the city was full of cars like that, polished, expensive, out of place in a lot meant for employees, and yet, something about it made her pause. The engine was not running, the windows tinted dark. Still, waiting, she told herself it meant nothing, that she was imagining connections where there were none, and she started walking again, her pace even, her shoulders squared, but before she reached the sidewalk, the car door opened, smooth, quiet, and he stepped out. Sebastian Moretti moved like he did everything else, without hurry, without hesitation, his presence filling the space around him without needing to announce itself. He closed the door behind him with a soft click and looked at her, not scanning, not assessing, just looking, like he already knew what he would find. Emily felt her breath catch for half a second before she steadied herself, her fingers tightening slightly around the strap of her bag. She did not step back, did not look away. "You again," she said, her voice calm, though her heart had begun to beat a little faster. He stopped a few feet away, close enough that she could see the detail in his expression, the calm control, the absence of anything rushed or uncertain. "You were expecting someone else," he replied, his tone even, not a question, not quite a statement, just something in between. She let out a small breath, almost a laugh but not quite. "I was expecting to go home," she answered, and for a moment, neither of them moved, the city noise filling the space between them, distant and irrelevant. He glanced briefly toward the restaurant behind her, then back at her. "You will," he said, "but not before you understand something." The words settled slowly, deliberate, and Emily felt that same shift again, that same quiet line being drawn somewhere she could not yet see. She tilted her head slightly, not defensive, not yielding, just waiting. "And what is that?" she asked, and for the first time, there was the faintest change in his expression, not softness, not warmth, but something close to certainty. "What happened to you," he said, his voice low, controlled, "does not happen twice." The statement hung in the air, not dramatic, not loud, but final in a way that made the world feel just a little smaller around them. Emily searched his face for a second longer, trying to understand what he meant, what he had done, what he was offering without saying it outright, and when she finally spoke, her voice was quieter than before. "You do not even know me," she said, and he held her gaze without hesitation, without doubt. "I know enough," he replied, and something in the way he said it made it clear that for him, that was all that mattered. Emily Carter held his gaze for a moment longer than she intended, her mind trying to catch up with the quiet certainty in his words. It was not the kind of promise people made lightly, and it was not the kind she had ever believed in, not in her world, not with her life. She shifted her weight slightly, tightening her grip on her bag as if grounding herself in something real. You cannot just decide things like that, she said. Her voice steady but softer now, less guarded, more honest than she meant to be. Sebastian Moretti did not move, did not step closer, but the space between them felt smaller anyway, like the air had adjusted around him. I do not decide everything, he replied calmly, only what I allow to continue. The distinction lingered, subtle but deliberate, and Emily felt it, the difference between control and choice, between force and intention. She exhaled slowly, glancing past him for a second at the empty lot, the quiet street beyond, then back at him. And you think I need that? She asked, not defensive, just questioning. His expression did not change, but there was a slight shift in his eyes, something that looked almost like recognition. I think you have been handling more than you should have to, he said, and for a moment, that was all. No explanation, no elaboration, just a statement that landed deeper than she expected, because it was not based on what he saw last night alone. It was based on something else, something he had already noticed. Emily felt her throat tighten slightly, not from emotion she could not control, but from the unfamiliar feeling of being understood without having to explain herself. She looked away first this time, just for a second, gathering herself. You do not know anything about my life, she said quietly, but the words lacked the sharpness they might have had before. Sebastian inclined his head slightly, not in agreement, not in disagreement, just acknowledgement. No, he said, but I know what it looks like when someone has learned to stay quiet to survive. The sentence was simple, but it cut through the space between them with precision, and Emily felt it, the truth in it, the way it mirrored something she had never said out loud. She let out a small breath, almost a laugh but without humor. And what exactly are you offering? She asked, her eyes meeting his again, searching now, not avoiding. He considered her for a moment, as if weighing the answer, not because he did not have one, but because he chose his words carefully. Nothing you have to take, he said, and nothing you have to pay for. The calm in his tone made it clear he meant it, that whatever he was extending was not a transaction, not something that came with hidden conditions, and that alone made it harder to believe. Emily frowned slightly, processing. That is not how things work, she said, almost to herself, and for the first time, there was the faintest hint of something in his expression that might have been understanding. In your world, maybe not, he replied. In mine, it depends on who is asking. The words settled between them, not as a challenge, not as pressure, but as a possibility, and Emily stood there, caught between the life she knew and something she did not, something that did not fit into the rules she had built for herself. A car passed on the street, headlights briefly illuminating the space before fading again, and in that brief moment of light, she saw him clearly, not just the control, not just the presence, but the stillness, the way he waited without pushing, without demanding, and that, more than anything, made her hesitate, because she was used to people taking, to expectations that came with every offer, to choices that were not really choices at all. She shifted her bag again, her voice quieter now, more careful. I have to go home, she said, and he nodded once, as if that had always been understood. You should, he replied, stepping back just enough to give her space without breaking the connection entirely. She hesitated for half a second, then turned, walking toward the sidewalk, her steps measured, her mind still turning over everything he had said, everything he had not said. And just before she reached the edge of the lot, his voice came again, not louder, not urgent, just enough to reach her. Emily, he said, and she stopped, turning slightly, surprised not by the sound of her name, but by the way he said it, like it had already been part of the conversation all along. You are allowed to expect better, he added, and the words followed her as she stepped onto the sidewalk and into the night, settling somewhere deeper than she was ready to admit. Emily Carter did not slow down until she reached the corner, the sound of her own footsteps grounding her as she moved through the familiar rhythm of the city. But his words stayed with her, not loud, not overwhelming, just steady, like something placed carefully where it could not be ignored. She told herself it was nothing, just a conversation, just a stranger with too much confidence and not enough understanding of how her life actually worked. But even as she repeated it in her mind, it did not feel entirely true. The bus ride home was quiet, the usual hum of the engine and the soft murmur of conversations around her blending into the background. And for once, she did not look at her reflection in the window. She looked past it, watching the lights pass by as if she could outrun the feeling that something had shifted. When she reached her apartment, the hallway smelled faintly of cleaning supplies and old carpet, the same as always, unchanged, and that steadiness helped. She unlocked the door and stepped inside, immediately drawn to the small figure curled up on the couch, her son still asleep, his blanket half slipping to the floor. She set her bag down quietly and adjusted it, her movements careful, automatic, and for a moment, everything else faded, the restaurant, the conversation, the strange sense of being seen in a way she had not asked for, all of it replaced by something simple and real. She sat on the edge of the couch, watching him breathe, counting each rise and fall of his chest as if it anchored her, because this was her world, this was what mattered, not promises from men she did not know, not lines drawn in places she had never chosen to stand. Later that night, after he had been tucked into bed and the apartment had settled into silence, she stood by the small kitchen window, a mug of tea cooling in her hands, her thoughts quieter now, but not gone. She replayed the conversation without meaning to, the way he had spoken, the way he had not asked for anything in return, and that was the part that unsettled her the most, because she was used to exchanges, to every kindness carrying a cost, to every offer being a form of negotiation, but this had not felt like that, it had felt final, and she did not know what to do with that. She shook her head slightly, setting the mug down and turning off the light, telling herself that tomorrow would be the same as every other day, that nothing had changed, that she would go to work, come home, take care of her son, and keep moving forward the way she always had, but across the city. In a space far removed from her quiet apartment, Sebastian Moretti stood in a dimly lit room, a single lamp casting long shadows across polished wood and glass. A file lay open on the table in front of him, a few photographs, a short summary, nothing excessive, just enough. He did not sit, did not rush, he simply looked, taking in the details with the same measured focus he applied to everything else. A life condensed into a few pages, a pattern that did not need explanation. He closed the file with a soft motion, his expression unchanged, and reached for his phone, dialing a number without hesitation. When the voice on the other end answered, he spoke calmly. "Adjust her schedule," he said, his tone even. "Make sure she is not working nights alone." There was a pause, a quiet acknowledgement, and then he added, "And the apartment." Another pause, shorter this time. "Fix what needs fixing." He ended the call without waiting for confirmation, because he did not need it, and for a moment he remained still, not watching anything, not thinking in the way most people would understand it, just existing in the certainty of a decision already made. While miles away, Emily turned off the last light in her apartment and lay down beside her son, her eyes closing slowly, unaware that somewhere beyond her control, small parts of her life had already begun to change, not in ways she would notice immediately, not in ways that would announce themselves, but in quiet, deliberate shifts that followed a single thought she had not chosen, that maybe, just maybe, she was allowed to expect better. The next morning did not announce itself as different. It arrived the same way every other morning did, with soft light pushing through thin curtains and the quiet sounds of a city already awake. But Emily Carter noticed it in the small things first, the radiator that had rattled for months now silent, the flickering kitchen light that had always needed a second switch now steady on the first try. She paused for a moment, standing in the middle of her apartment with her coffee in hand, her eyes moving slowly from one detail to another, not confused, not alarmed, just aware, like noticing a room had been rearranged while she slept. Her son shuffled into the kitchen, rubbing his eyes, asking for breakfast in a voice still thick with sleep, and she smiled, setting the mug down and moving automatically, because whatever had changed, her routine had not. She still needed to get him ready, still needed to catch the bus, still needed to show up and keep everything moving forward. But even as she moved through the motions, the thought lingered, quiet and persistent. This was not coincidence, it could not be. She tried to dismiss it, telling herself that maintenance must have finally come through, that someone had fixed things while she was at work, that there was always a reasonable explanation if she looked hard enough. But deep down, she knew she had never filed a request, never called anyone to fix anything, because she had learned not to expect things to be handled unless she handled them herself. The walk to the bus felt different again, not because the city had changed, but because she was noticing it now. The steady rhythm of footsteps, the distant sirens, the hum of Traffic, all of it grounding her in a world that still felt familiar even as something beneath it shifted. At the restaurant, the difference was harder to ignore. The manager who barely acknowledged her before now nodded with a level of attention that felt almost intentional. Her section was reassigned, not dramatically, just slightly better, closer to the center, easier, more visible. And when she glanced at the schedule posted near the kitchen, her name stood out immediately. No late shifts. No closing nights, just daytime hours that lined up almost perfectly with her son's school schedule. She stared at it for a second longer than necessary, her fingers brushing the edge of the paper as if confirming it was real. "Did you see?" Maria whispered from beside her, appearing without warning, her voice low but filled with curiosity. "They changed everything this morning." Emily nodded slowly, her eyes still on the schedule. "I see it," she said quietly, and Maria studied her for a moment, as if trying to connect something she could not quite name. "You think it is because of last night?" she asked carefully, and Emily hesitated, just for a second, before shaking her head, not because she believed it, but because saying it out loud would make it real. "No," she replied, her tone even. "Things change." Maria did not look convinced. But she nodded anyway, stepping back as the shift began to pick up, leaving Emily standing there with the quiet certainty settling deeper into her chest, because she knew now, not with proof, not with explanation, but with the same instinct that had taught her how to survive, that none of this was random, that somewhere, someone had decided to adjust the weight she carried, not by asking, not by offering, but by acting. And she did not need to look far to understand who that someone was. Later that afternoon, as she stepped outside for a brief break, the sunlight warmer against her skin, the noise of the city steady around her, she leaned lightly against the wall, her thoughts quieter now, more focused, and for the first time since that night, she did not question whether it had meant something. She questioned what it meant for her, because if what he said was true, if what he had done was real, then the line she had always lived within had already been moved, and she had not been the one to move it. The afternoon moved slower than the morning, as if the city itself had decided to give her time to notice what had changed. Emily Carter carried plates between tables with the same steady rhythm, but her mind no longer pushed everything aside just to get through the shift. Now it observed, it connected, it questioned. Every small adjustment around her felt intentional, not overwhelming, not obvious, just precise, like someone had quietly removed obstacles she had learned to step around for years. A difficult customer reassigned before she reached the table, a last-minute schedule conflict resolved before it became her problem. Even the manager's tone softer, more measured when he spoke to her, not kind, not friendly, just careful, and that was new. She caught her reflection briefly in the polished surface of a glass panel, pausing for half a second as she looked at herself. Nothing had changed on the outside. The same uniform, the same tired eyes that had learned how to stay calm under pressure, but something inside felt different, not stronger, not yet, just less alone, and that thought unsettled her more than anything else, because she had built her life around the certainty that she had to carry everything herself, that depending on anyone was a risk she could not afford. And now, without asking, without agreeing, something had shifted that foundation. During her break, she stepped outside again, the sunlight softer now, casting long shadows across the sidewalk. She leaned against the wall, arms folded loosely, her eyes tracing the movement of cars passing by, people walking, life continuing in its usual pattern, and yet she felt separate from it for a moment, like she was standing just slightly outside the version of her life she had always known. Her phone buzzed in her pocket and she pulled it out quickly, a message from her son's school reminding her of an early pickup time the next day, and she froze for a second before checking her schedule again, confirming what she had already seen. She would be off in time, no scrambling, no last-minute calls, no apologies for being late, just a simple, manageable day. She exhaled slowly, her shoulders relaxing in a way they had not in a long time, and that was when it truly settled in, not as a suspicion, not as a possibility, but as something real. This was not random, this was not luck, this was him. She did not need proof, she did not need confirmation. The pattern was too clear, too precise, and the realization brought with it a mix of emotions she could not easily separate. Relief, because something in her life had become easier, resistance, because she had not chosen it, and something else, something quieter, that she was not ready to name. She closed her eyes briefly, pressing her fingers lightly against her temple, trying to steady her thoughts. because this was not just about help, it was about control, about influence, about someone stepping into her life without permission and rearranging it in ways that mattered, and even if the results were good, even if they made things easier, that did not mean she could accept it without question. She opened her eyes again, her gaze steady now, focused, because if this was happening, if he had decided to involve himself in her world, then she needed to understand it on her terms, not his, and that meant she could not ignore it, could not pretend it would fade on its own. Later that evening, as her shift came to an end and the sky deepened into twilight, she stepped out into the parking lot with a different kind of awareness, not uncertainty, not hesitation, but intention. Her eyes moved across the space, searching without rushing, and when she saw the familiar black car parked near the far edge again, she did not stop, did not hesitate, she walked toward it, her steps even, her shoulders straight, because this time, she was not being caught off guard, this time, she was choosing to step into whatever this was. And as the door opened and Sebastian Moretti stepped out once more, she met his gaze without pause, her voice calm, controlled, but carrying something new, something firmer than before. "We need to talk," she said, not as a request, but as a decision, and for the first time since that night, the line between them was not something he had drawn alone. Emily Carter did not break eye contact as Sebastian Moretti stepped fully into the dim light of the parking lot, the city noise fading into the background like it always did when he was near, not because it disappeared, but because his presence made everything else feel less important, less immediate. He studied her for a moment, not surprised, not challenged, just aware of the shift in her posture. The difference in the way she held herself. "We are talking," he said calmly, his voice even, as if this had always been the next step. Emily shook her head slightly, taking one step closer, closing the distance just enough to make it clear she was not standing where he left her anymore. "No," she replied, her tone steady but firm. "You are going to explain." The words settled between them, not sharp, not aggressive, but clear, and for a brief second, something in his expression changed, not resistance, not irritation, something closer to acknowledgement, like he had been waiting for this moment. He nodded once, slow, deliberate. "All right," he said, and the simplicity of that answer caught her off guard more than any argument would have. She folded her arms loosely, grounding herself. "You changed things," she continued, her eyes searching his. "My schedule, my apartment, even how people treat me at work. You do not get to do that without telling me why." There was no accusation in her voice, just truth, just the line she was drawing for herself. Sebastian listened without interrupting, his gaze steady, taking in every word as if it mattered, as if she mattered, and when she finished, he did not respond immediately. He let the silence sit for a moment, not as pressure, but as space. "You are right," he said finally, his voice low, controlled. "I made adjustments." He did not deny it, did not soften it, just stated it as fact, and something about that honesty made it harder for her to push back. "Why?" she asked again, this time quieter. Not because she was unsure, but because she needed the answer. He took a small step closer, not enough to invade her space, just enough to make his presence more defined. "Because you needed it," he said, simple, direct, and Emily let out a small breath, almost frustrated. "That is not an answer," she said, shaking her head. "People do not just step into someone else's life like that." His gaze did not waver. "Most people do not," he replied. "I do." The certainty in his tone was not arrogance. It was something deeper, something rooted in a world she did not fully understand. She looked at him for a long second, searching for something she could push against, something she could reject, but there was no pressure in him, no expectation in his stance, just the quiet weight of someone who had already made his decision. "You do not even know what I want," she said, her voice softer now, and this time, he did not answer immediately. He studied her, really looked at her, the tired edges, the strength she carried without showing it, the way she held herself like she was always ready to take on more than she should have to. "You want stability," he said finally, not guessing, not assuming, just stating it like he had seen it written somewhere. "You want your son to be safe, you want to stop choosing between what is urgent and what is important." Emily felt her chest tighten slightly, not from fear, but from recognition, because he was not wrong, and that made everything more complicated. She looked away for a brief second, collecting herself, then back at him. "And what do you want?" she asked, the question hanging in the air with more weight than anything she had said before. Sebastian's expression did not change, but there was a pause this time, a slight shift in the silence before he answered. "I want things to be the way they should be," he said, his voice quieter now, not less certain, just more measured, "and what happened to you was not that." The words landed differently, not as control, not as interference, but as a correction, and Emily stood there, caught between resistance and understanding, because for the first time, this did not feel like someone taking control of her life. It felt like someone refusing to let it stay the way it had been, and she did not yet know if that was something she could accept or something she needed to fight against. Emily Carter did not respond right away, the silence stretching between them as she tried to steady the thoughts racing just beneath her calm expression. His answer had not been what she expected, not control, not possession, but something that felt more dangerous in a different way, something that did not ask for permission because it did not see itself as something that needed it. She exhaled slowly, her arms still folded but her posture shifting, less defensive, more deliberate. "You keep saying things like that," she said quietly, her eyes holding his, "like you get to decide what is right for me." Sebastian Moretti did not interrupt, did not react, he simply listened, his stillness almost unnerving in the way it gave her space to finish every thought without pressure. "I have spent years figuring out how to make my life work," she continued, her voice steady but carrying the weight of everything she had built alone. "It is not perfect, but it is mine." The word settled heavily, not as a challenge, but as a boundary, and for a moment, neither of them moved, the distant sound of traffic filling the space where silence had taken hold. He nodded once, slowly, acknowledging what she said without dismissing it. "I am not taking that from you," he replied, his tone even. "I am removing what should not have been there to begin with." The distinction was subtle, but it landed differently. Not as an argument, but as a perspective she had not considered. Emily frowned slightly, searching his face again, trying to understand where the line was, where his influence ended and her control began. "And what happens when I say I do not want it?" she asked, the question quieter now, but more important than anything else she had said. Sebastian held her gaze without hesitation. "Then I stop," he answered, simple, direct, without hesitation, and that answer caught her off guard more than anything else, because it did not come with conditions, did not carry doubt, it was just there, solid and certain. She studied him for a long second, trying to find the catch, trying to see if there was something behind it that she was missing, but there was nothing in his expression that suggested anything other than truth, and that unsettled her in a way she had not expected, because she was used to resistance, to negotiation, to having to fight for every inch of space she held. But he was not pushing, he was not taking, he was offering control back to her in a way she had not realized she had lost. She let out a slow breath, her shoulders easing just slightly. "You really think it is that simple?" she said, almost to herself. And for the first time, there was the faintest hint of something softer in his expression, not warmth exactly, but understanding. "No," he said, "I think it is difficult." A brief pause, then, "But that does not make it complicated." The words lingered, settling into the space between them with quiet weight, and Emily felt something shift again, not around her this time, but inside, something small but undeniable. She looked down for a second, then back up, her voice steadier now, more certain. "You do not get to make decisions for me," she said, not as a rejection, but as a condition, and Sebastian inclined his head slightly, accepting it without argument. "Then make them," he replied, his tone calm, almost encouraging, and that was the moment it changed, not because he pushed, not because he insisted, but because he stepped back just enough to leave the choice in her hands, the power in her space, and Emily realized that whatever this was, whatever he was offering, it was not about taking control of her life, it was about changing the terms she had been forced to live under. And for the first time since that night, she did not feel like she was reacting to him, she felt like she was standing on her own ground, deciding what came next. And as the city lights flickered around them, casting long shadows across the pavement, she met his gaze again, not uncertain, not overwhelmed, just present, because this was no longer about what he had done, it was about what she would allow, and that was something no one had ever given her before. Emily Carter felt the shift settle fully into place, not around her, but within her, like something long held in tension had finally been given space to breathe. She did not step back this time, did not look away. instead she stood there in the quiet of the parking lot with a steadiness that had not been there before. "Then I will," she said, her voice calm, grounded, and for the first time since this began, it did not sound like survival. It sounded like choice. Sebastian Moretti watched her. Without interruption, his gaze steady, not pushing, not guiding, just present, as if this moment mattered more than anything he could say next. Emily let out a slow breath, her arms lowering from where they had been folded, her posture easing but not weakening. "You helped," she continued, the words deliberate. "I am not going to pretend you did not." She paused briefly, as if weighing what came next. "But that does not mean you get to keep deciding things for me." There was no anger in her tone, no accusation, just clarity, and that made it stronger. He inclined his head slightly, accepting the boundary without hesitation. "Understood," he replied, simple, direct, and something about the way he said it made her believe him, not because of the words themselves, but because of the way he carried them, like they were already part of the structure he operated within. Emily nodded once, almost to herself, then glanced past him for a moment at the city beyond, the lights, the movement. The life that had always continued whether she felt ready or not, and then she looked back at him. "If anything changes in my life," she said, her voice steady, "it happens because I choose it." A pause, just long enough to make sure the meaning settled, not because someone else thinks it should. The air between them shifted again, but this time it was different, not tension, not uncertainty, something more balanced, more defined. Sebastian held her gaze, considering her words, and then he nodded once more, slower this time, more deliberate. "Then choose," he said, his tone calm but carrying something firm beneath it, "and I will respect it." The statement was not a challenge, not a test, just a line drawn alongside hers, and Emily felt it, the alignment of something that did not take away from her control but stood parallel to it. She let out a quiet breath, her shoulders relaxing just slightly, because this was something she understood: boundaries, choices, consequences, things she had built her life around, and for the first time since he had stepped into her world, she did not feel like she was reacting to him. She felt like she was standing with him, on equal ground, even if their worlds were nothing alike. A car passed slowly at the edge of the lot, headlights sweeping briefly across them before fading into the distance, and in that moment of shifting light, Emily saw him differently, not just as someone with power, but as someone who knew how to hold it without forcing it. And that realization stayed with her longer than anything else. She adjusted the strap of her bag, her voice quieter now but certain. "Then this is my choice," she said, meeting his eyes one last time. "You do not change anything else unless I ask." The words were simple, but they carried everything she needed them to, and Sebastian did not hesitate, did not question. He simply nodded. "Agreed," he said, and that was it. No negotiation, no hesitation, just acceptance, and for a moment, the world felt still, like something important had settled into place. Without needing to be announced, Emily held his gaze for 1 second longer, then turned, walking toward the sidewalk with steady steps, not rushed, not uncertain, just moving forward, and as she stepped into the rhythm of the city once again, she felt it clearly, the difference, not in what had changed around her, but in what had changed within her, because this time, whatever came next would not be something done to her. It would be something she chose, and that was a power she had not realized she had been waiting to claim. Emily Carter did not look back as she left the parking lot, but she felt it, not his presence following her, not his attention pulling her back, just the quiet certainty that something had settled between them, something defined by her words this time. Not his. The walk home felt different in a way she could not fully explain, not lighter, not easier, but clearer, like the path in front of her was no longer shaped by what she had to endure but by what she was willing to accept. When she stepped into her apartment, the familiar warmth greeted her immediately, her son already awake, sitting cross-legged on the floor with a small stack of crayons spread around him. He looked up the moment she entered, his face lighting in a way that made everything else fade into the background. "You are home early," he said, his voice bright with surprise, and Emily smiled, setting her bag down as she knelt beside him. "I am," she replied softly, brushing a hand over his hair, and for a moment, that was all that mattered, the simplicity of being there, of not rushing, of not calculating every minute against everything else she had to do. Later that evening, after dinner and homework and the quiet routine that made their small space feel like home, Emily stood by the window again, the city stretching out beyond the glass, familiar and steady, but her thoughts were no longer circling the same questions. They had shifted, not toward him, but toward herself, toward what she had said, what she had claimed, the boundaries she had drawn without hesitation. She replayed the moment in her mind, not as something uncertain, but as something solid, something she could stand on. Because for the first time, someone with power had not taken it from her, had not tried to reshape her choices, but had stepped back when she asked, and that mattered more than anything he had done before. Across the city, Sebastian Moretti stood in the quiet of his office, the lights low, the city visible through the glass behind him. One of his associates stood nearby, waiting, a file in hand that remained unopened. "Everything has been adjusted as requested," the man said. His tone respectful but measured. Sebastian did not turn immediately, his gaze fixed on the skyline. "No," he replied calmly, "everything has been adjusted as she requested." The correction was subtle, but it carried weight, and the man nodded, understanding without needing further explanation. There was a pause. Then, "Do we maintain the current oversight?" The question careful, neutral. Sebastian remained still for a moment longer before answering. "No," he said simply, "we step back." The decision was not hesitation, not uncertainty, just alignment with what had been said, what had been agreed, and with that, the conversation ended, the room returning to silence, while miles away, Emily turned away from the window, her mind steady now, her thoughts no longer pulled in different directions, because whatever had begun that night, whatever had shifted in the days since, it had reached a point where she understood her place in it, not as someone being protected without choice, not as someone being changed without consent, but as someone who had the final say. The next morning would come, the routine would continue, her life would move forward, but now, there was something new beneath it, not dependence, not expectation, but awareness, the knowledge that the world could change around her, but only if she allowed it to. And as she turned off the light and moved toward her son's room, she carried that with her, not as a question, but as an answer she had already chosen. The next morning felt quieter in a way Emily Carter had not experienced before, not because the city had slowed down, but because something inside her had. The rush that used to define every step, every decision, every breath had softened into something steadier, more deliberate. She moved through her routine with calm precision, preparing breakfast, helping her son get ready, walking him to school without checking the time every 30 seconds, and when he looked up at her with a small smile and said, "You are not in a hurry today," she realized he noticed it too. The difference was not just hers, it was visible, tangible, real. She smiled back, brushing his hair gently before he ran inside, and as she stood there for a moment watching him disappear through the school doors, she felt something settle into place, not excitement, not relief, something quieter, something stronger, certainty. The day unfolded the same way her life always had, work, responsibilities, small decisions. That kept everything moving forward, but now each choice felt intentional, not forced, not rushed. When she arrived at the restaurant, the atmosphere remained calm, respectful, the subtle changes still present but no longer surprising. She worked her shift with confidence that did not come from anyone else's actions, but from her own understanding of where she stood, and when a customer spoke sharply, testing the same line others had crossed before, she did not shrink, did not deflect, she met it calmly, firmly, and the moment passed without escalation, without humiliation, just handled, just done, and that was when she knew, not because of what had been removed from her life, but because of what she now held within it. Later that evening, as the sun dipped low and the city lights began to take over once again, she stepped outside into the cooling air, her shift complete, her mind clear. She paused for a moment, not searching, not expecting, just present, and for the first time since that night, there was no black car waiting, no figure stepping forward from the shadows, no interruption to the path she had chosen, and instead of feeling uncertain, she felt grounded, because that absence was not a loss, it was confirmation. He had stepped back, just as he said he would. The space between their worlds now defined not by distance, but by respect. She took a slow breath, the air cool against her skin, and began to walk, her step steady, her pace unhurried, the city moving around her in its endless rhythm, and somewhere across that distance, in a place she did not need to see, Sebastian Moretti continued with his world, unchanged in its scale, unchanged in its power, but altered in one quiet, deliberate way. He had chosen not to interfere where he once would have, not because he could not, but because she had asked him not to, and that choice held its own kind of strength. As Emily reached her apartment building, climbing the familiar steps and unlocking the door, she carried that understanding with her, not as something external, not as something owed, but as something earned, because what had begun as a moment of humiliation had not ended in rescue, it had ended in something far more lasting, the reclaiming of her own voice, her own boundaries, her own right to decide what her life would be. And as she stepped inside, the warm light welcoming her home, she did not think about what had been done for her, she thought about what she had chosen for herself, and for the first time in a long time, that was enough.